And now it is my great pleasure, friends, to introduce our amazing panel to talk about what we've just heard and to help us understand the ideas and the struggles in the biography of the women who we saw highlighted at the end of the video. So I'm now going to introduce our panelists. Marcia Chatland is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. She co-hosts Slate's podcast, The Waves, which is a bi-weekly show that covers feminism, gender, and popular culture. She appeared in the PBS special, The Vote, honoring those who fought for women's suffrage in the US, and she's the author of 3 books, including her most recent book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. Marcia Chatland, welcome, and thanks so much for joining. And Gail Heriot is Professor of Law at the University of San Diego Law School and currently a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. She co-wrote the 19th Amendment's explainers for the National Constitution Center's interactive Constitution with Nancy Gertner, who was sorry not to be able to join us tonight. And I want you, friends, to go after the show to the interactive Constitution and read Gail Heriot's brilliant explanation of it, as well as her separate statement about it. And she also served as an advisor to the Constitution Center's new 19th Amendment exhibit. Welcome, Gail Heriot. It's so great to have you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And my amazing colleague, Elena Popchock, is the exhibition developer at the National Constitution Center. I must once again express appreciation to her for her path-breaking ability to bring to life stories in 3-dimensional forms, and as well as the ideas behind them, and to tell a constitutional, legal, and political story in such a galvanizing way is an extraordinary achievement that will adorn the National Constitution Center, I hope, forever. And since she's been with us since 2016, and she also served as the lead developer for our equally inspiring exhibit, Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. Elena, thank you, and thank you for joining tonight.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, let's jump right in to the great song cycle. And the first text that we heard Janae Bridges sing so beautifully was by, I want to make sure that I have the right one because there was that great preamble, of course. And then we began with Susan B. Anthony. And the text that we heard from was her wonderful resolution in 1872, resolved that the women of the nation in 1876 have greater cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution than the men of 1776, and she ends, no self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex. That followed the prelude, which of course was from the Seneca Falls Convention itself. Elena, I think I'll just ask you to start because you had to decide where to begin the exhibit and what story to tell. How do you tell the story that begins in some ways, of course, before Seneca Falls, but we have the Seneca Falls Declaration, and then you move to 1876 and to Susan B. Anthony. Tell us how the exhibit deals with that great story.
Sure. So with every exhibit, you have to make a decision of where in time you're going to start. And we had a lot of conversations about it, and we ended up starting in 1848. That is the first formal women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. But we knew we also had to help visitors understand, well, why were women fighting for the vote at that time? Why were they fighting for other rights, such as, rights to their own property, their children, wages, all of these very important things, and working with, in particular, Gail on this part of the exhibit to make sure people understood the right to vote at that time was limited to certain men by 1848. And that fighting for suffrage was only one demand among many at Seneca Falls. And we hear that and read that in the Declaration of Sentiments, which we do have a rare printing in the exhibit. And I'll fast forward a little bit in time to get to Susan B. Anthony and how we do feature her in the exhibit particularly when during Reconstruction, she, like many other women, tried to go to the polls and argue that the 14th Amendment granted her citizenship and she should be able to vote. And she was ultimately arrested and fined and charged with illegally voting. And we have a letter that she wrote a couple months after she did that. And she's expressing her surprise and shock at having actually been convicted for that crime. But it certainly was an example for all other women who were trying that tactic.
Thank you so much for that. Marcia Chatland, there's so much to say, of course, about the evolution from Seneca Falls to 1876, but what would you like to highlight about Susan B. Anthony?
Well, I think that Susan B. Anthony and all the women who are featured in this cycle represent something that I often explain to my students about the deep animating energy of this movement. These women were incredibly intellectually engaged, thoughtful people who had spent years in both formal and informal study, and to understand your capacities in a society and then know that they are cut off by these legal mechanisms is something that is incredibly poignant and sustains a lot of movements. And I think that the other part of understanding the origins of this iteration of women's rights struggle is to understand that women in a number of capacities were already being citizens, and they didn't have the formal right to vote. And I think that this is a really important thing for us to note, that while voting is an incredibly powerful act, for the majority of our nation's history, when people were excluded from the ballot, they still were being good citizens by creating community resources, by supporting each other. And so I think that for a lot of these women, while they're listening to these often sexist debates about their capacity, they knew what they were able to do, and they were able to use those collective energies in order to make a case for women's suffrage.
Thank you so much for that. Gail, Heriot, in your definitive explainer on the interactive constitution, you note that women were indeed voting in the colonial era. In New Jersey, they had the right to vote until 1807, and then it was rescinded. What would you like our friends to know about that important transition point that maybe begins with the Declaration at Seneca Falls and then takes us up to Susan B. Anthony in 1876?
You mean you don't want me to talk about New Jersey? New Jersey.
Yeah, no, please do. Please do. Tell us about New
There were
Jersey.
actually women voting in New Jersey, starting with their 1776 Constitution, which might have been a mistake. I don't know whether they really intended that, but they said all inhabitants who otherwise, have the property qualification and all could vote. And then in the 1790s, they made it clear that yes, they meant women. But then in the very early 19th century, there were all sorts of voter fraud allegations, including allegations that some men had voted once, come back dressed as women and voted a second time, and they very quietly got rid of the women's vote. The thing I wanted to, and alas, I don't know if anybody objected as loudly as they should have. There's not recorded in history. But looking then ahead to Susan B. Anthony, she is, I think, quite rightly a little bit, she's discouraged at the time that she's writing that little piece. But in some sense, maybe she shouldn't have been, because the revolution was already taking place over in Wyoming. A couple of years before Anthony wrote the piece that we just heard, which was fabulous, by the way. The Wyoming territory, and Wyoming was just a territory at the time, had included votes for women in that territorial constitution. And when they applied to be a state, Congress initially balked. They didn't want Wyoming to be a state if women could vote. So it was communicated back to the Wyoming legislature that, yeah, you got to get rid of this thing about women voting. That could give women in the rest of the country some ideas we don't want to give them. And to their everlasting credit, the Wyoming legislature wired back to Washington, we will stay out of the Union 100 years before we come in without the women. Which I've always liked that story. And so there's my little contribution for cheering Susan B. Anthony up at that point in time.
Well, thank you for that. And yes, indeed, the performance was fabulous. And thank you, friends, for watching. There's lots of great comments in the comment box. Wow, what a wonderful production. Love the music and the episode of Without It Be Wells. All congratulating Janae Bridges and Patrice Michaels for their amazing job. And friends, please chat questions in the Q&A box. And if we have time after talking about the figures who we just heard about, would love to pose them to our panelists. Elena, the exhibit does such a spectacular job at basically telling the story of the forces that changed public opinion, male public opinion about women's suffrage. But one of the central stories that you talk about is, of course, race. And our second piece, Patrice's second piece, is from Sojourner Truth. That piece was dedicated to Janae Bridges, and it's from her address to the Women's Rights Convention in 1851. May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's right. I am above 80 years old. It is about time for me to be going. I have been here 40 years a slave and 40 years free, and would be here 40 years more to have equal rights for all. Elena, how does the exhibit deal with the important question of race and the right to vote, and of course that about Sojourner Truth and her central role in the fight for women's suffrage?
Well, working on the exhibit and reading and learning about Sojourner Truth, I think her story in particular captures early on, 1850s, how white women actually were manipulating her voice and her words in order to, in their minds, project an idea of what a formerly enslaved woman should sound like. And they often would rewrite her speeches in order to present that type of figure and that stereotype. And it becomes very challenging for an historian to parse that out and figure out what are the true sources. When we traditionally hear that speech where she's saying, "Ain't I a woman?" that did not happen. And that was an instance where her words were butchered to sound like that. So she's one of the earliest figures that we see how that manipulation is happening and how white women are trying to control the narrative and ultimately exclude certain Black women from the movement that didn't kind of fit that type.
Thank you very much for that. And you convey that so powerfully in the exhibit. I'm in the comments box, a bunch of great questions. Please credit the fantastic pianist. Yes, indeed, Kristen Roach. I mentioned Laura Ward at the beginning, but I must thank her again. She was so beautiful, and I loved her intervention of reading the objection from white women, which Janae Bridges responded to. That was an incredibly moving touch. Is the exhibit virtual as well as physical, asks Adele Nicholson. We've put some of it online. Elena's given some great exhibit tours, and you can go to the exhibit page. Oh, and friends, here's the most amazing thing. There are 3 incredible online interactives, which are all online on the Interactive Constitution. So you can trace early drafts of the 19th Amendment and see that in as early as 1868, one draft would have guaranteed universal suffrage for all African-American men and women alike, but that was narrowed. There's another interactive that shows the state-by-state debate about the right to vote, which is riveting. And then there's one where you can actually hear the debates, which Elena and her team brought to life. So all of that is online. Go learn from it as soon as this show is over, because it's so great to share this with the world. And that's, Elena, that was another just phenomenal job you guys did in putting that together. Marcia Chatland, you've written powerfully about Sojourner Truth, as well as the fissure between African-American and white women during the fight for women's suffrage. Tell us about Sojourner Truth and the broader movements that she represented.
Yes, Elena's point is well taken, and I have an illustrative example that I use with my students at Georgetown. If you go to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., they have a series of needlepoint cushions, prayer cushions, that are supposed to represent American history. And the one that represents Sojourner Truth has the representation of cotton. And I took a picture of it and I showed it to my students and I said, at the end of the semester, you should be able to spot why this representation is wrong. And I think that when we think about African-American women in slavery, so much of the dominant frame has been Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And so my students are often surprised, and a lot of people are surprised, to realize that she was enslaved in New York, that she did not run away from slavery, that in fact she was part of the amelioration and gradual emancipation strategy of the state of New York, that she spoke Dutch, that her experience of enslavement was on a dairy farm. And I think that this is so critically important to understand Sojourner Truth in relationship to not only the question of race as it informed the political decisions of the suffrage movement, but to also understand the political uses of history as a symbol. And Sojourner Truth as a figure emerges in the 19th century and reemerges in various contexts throughout the civil rights movement. Women like Rosa Parks, who were activists around issues of voting, as well as investigating sexual violence against Black women in the South. They named their clubs after Sojourner Truth. And again, we see white women in feminist movements in the 60s and 70s take her icon as a way of thinking about women's rights broadly. And so she is an incredible figure, not only in this question of suffrage and the question of slavery, but in religious thought, her own times as a spiritual wanderer. And so all of this is to say that at this moment, we have this incredible opportunity to go back and rethink the historical figures we've been presented with. And everyone should do themselves a favor and read Nell Painter's book about Sojourner Truth, which is such a beautifully and richly done text, because it not only tells her story, but it talks about the ways that we have to be so careful not to manipulate historical figures for our own purposes.
Thank you for that. Thanks for the great book recommendation of Nell Painter's book. We'll try to put it in the chat for our friends. And the more reading recommendations, the better from all of our panelists. We must read and learn about this crucial period. Gail, Heriot, so much to say.